Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yang Mulia Excellency Tan Sri Sheikh Hamid Albar, Secretary General of ASEAN, Dr. Surin Pitsuwan, distinguished speakers, participants, colleagues, and friends. May I begin by expressing my most profound appreciation and thanks for the kind invitation for myself to speak and to share thoughts before such an august gathering. Such a forum that is marked by people of great distinction and profound knowledge on developments to do with our region. I have been asked earlier to speak or to share some thoughts on the issue of East Asian regionalism. And with Pak Hamid Albar's kind consent, I wish very much to engage more in a discussion rather than my own thoughts to be presented. But as an introductory thoughts, I would like to share some ideas. First, I believe that when we speak of East Asian regionalism, this cannot be viewed in a vacuum. East Asian regionalism cannot be viewed in a vacuum for a number of reasons. First, because I believe, and this is increasingly the norm nowadays, it is actually extremely difficult to distinguish between what is national, what is bilateral, regional, and indeed global. I think the world that we all practice in nowadays, the distinctions between these levels are almost not there. Especially when we address issues that are increasingly now being presented at all the different levels that I had mentioned. That there are issues that appears not only at the national level, but there are also issues that burdens bilateral relations, as well as regional and global level as well. Most importantly, as a result, therefore, the addressing or the overcoming of these problems or challenges defy national solutions. In other words, cooperation becomes a key prerequisite, and not a single nation, however powerful they are, can address these problems on their own. Another reality that I think must be borne in mind when we speak of East Asian regionalism is the fact that it is nowadays almost impossible to distinguish between what is political, what is economic, strategic, security. Rather, they are all enmeshed and they are all interlinked, and that the solution to one requires awareness of the other problems and challenges. Given these realities, the reality that East Asian regionalism does not take place in a vacuum, rather in the kind of world that I had just now tried to suggest, I would like to present some thoughts. First, as far as Indonesia is concerned, when we speak of East Asian regionalism, it must first and foremost be built upon or anchored on ASEAN itself. It is not possible for us to postulate, to think about East Asian regionalism without first and foremost having a thought-through view and ideas and concepts about ASEAN itself. For us, in other words, ASEAN, its evolution, its development, its strengthening is a key and indispensable element in any discourse on East Asian regionalism. And now, of course, I think most of you would acknowledge that over its years of existence, decades of existence, ASEAN's contribution, ASEAN's role has been quite transformational for the Southeast Asian region, an area which prior to 1967 was marked by a great deal of tension, and even, in some instances, open conflict, has been transformed, relatively speaking, to a secure area that can enjoy peace and security. However, I think all of us within ASEAN, and I think the Secretary General would be the person who knows best about this, all of us recognize that we cannot be complacent and that we must continue to nurture, to develop, and to strengthen ASEAN's existence and ASEAN's capacity. That, in fact, was the reason why back in 2003-2005, ASEAN began the process of ASEAN community building, a project that was then, certainly in the political security domain, was often questioned what its relevance or what its purpose was. Because from the vantage point of the international setting in 2003, there were those who then asked or wondered whether this was a case of ASEAN trying to find a new mission, a new vision that was felt to be quite unnecessary. But I think all of us now, looking back to what ASEAN has done over the past 10 years or so, 7 years or so, would recognize that it was thanks to the farsightedness of ASEAN at the time that we have been able to develop ASEAN as it has in a far more positive way than otherwise would be the case. In 2011, therefore, as chair of ASEAN, Indonesia, and now, following the summit last month, all ASEAN countries are resolved to ensure that during the year 2011, we make significant progress in ASEAN community building. In other words, we must ensure 4 years only now, away from 2015, we make the kind of significant progress that ASEAN actually must make if we are to really achieve this community by 2015. Here, State Secretary General, whenever we have ASEAN summits and ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, always presents a report, a status report, a scorecard of where we are on ASEAN community building. And as a result, I think all of us in ASEAN are very much mindful there is still a great deal to be achieved, and that we must not be complacent, and that we must really make progress in the time that we have until 2015. And especially, as chair of ASEAN, Indonesia this year is extremely keen to ensure that ASEAN made progress in the area of conflict resolution and conflict prevention. Of course, all the three pillars are equally important: economic, socio-cultural, security and political. But without security, without peace, it would not be possible to embark on any other activities and pursuits such as economic development and social progress. And as a result, therefore, we are making conflict resolution the Blue Ribbon project in ASEAN for 2011. But this does not mean more resolution. It does not mean more agreements. It doesn't mean more declarations, because we have enough of those on our plate, to be honest. It's just a matter of doing it. It's just a matter of getting things done. Because on our table, in our ASEAN documents are all prevalent. We have mechanisms, we have infrastructures, but we must now move beyond intentions. We must move beyond plans for action, and by actually getting around to utilizing some of these infrastructures. Of course, this is a process. It is not an event. We must create a comfort level to make it normal and to make it not unusual for ASEAN countries to resort to ASEAN mechanisms when situations require it. And in this instance, the most recent example of such a case, of course, is the relations between Thailand and Cambodia, which is now being sought to be addressed through the ASEAN mechanism. Therefore, East Asian regionalism, first and foremost, as far as Indonesia is concerned, it must begin and concentrate on ASEAN regionalism as well, investing, developing ASEAN's capacity in all three pillars, and not least in the political security pillars, and not least in the governance issues. I should have mentioned as well just now, when we look at developments in North Africa, when we look at developments in the Middle East, recent developments, we are reminded how the deficit in political development, deficit in governance issues can quickly find its manifestation in the classic security challenge and threat as well. And that is why we also must build this capacity within ASEAN. Second point, it is not, of course, enough for all of us to simply be absorbed by ASEAN itself. ASEAN has always been outward looking, has a tremendous outreach beyond its own confines, beyond Southeast Asia. And now the question for all of us when we talk of East Asian regionalism is how we can help ensure that ASEAN maintain a so-called driving seat role or be in centrality to these efforts. This is now, as the Secretary General and colleagues I'm sure would be aware, it is not a given. It will not happen simply by repeating over and over again as if ASEAN is in centrality, that ASEAN is in the driving seat role. It is a role that must be claimed, it must be earned, and that there is a contribution that ASEAN must make. And in this connection, of course, ASEAN is not a newcomer to this kind of regional architecture building in East Asia. When we think of ZOPFAN, Zone of Peace, Freedom, and Neutrality, which I saw is one of the topics to be discussed at this particular conference, it shows an ASEAN that provided an answer to a Cold War type of setting by declaring itself as a zone that is free, that is peaceful and neutral from Cold War type of threats. The Southeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, I guess, is another manifestation of that exclusionary type of approach. But is it enough in today's setting when we no longer have an East-West confrontation? In fact, that the world is far more dynamic and far more fluid. Of course, ASEAN has also developed all kinds of processes, the ASEAN +1 processes, the ASEAN +3, ASEAN Regional Forum, the ADMM now, plus even the East Asia Summit. In other words, practically the main or the principal East Asian regional architecture, quite a few of them are actually ASEAN-derived, ASEAN-initiated. We become almost like an incubator for various other sub-regions to then take it over. Look at the ASEAN +3. In the past, the three only meets in the sidelines of ASEAN. But now that the comfort level has been built, we are aware and we are witnessing in a very positive way the +3 countries meeting at the summit level on their own, which is great to see because it reflects an ASEAN that has created a multiplier effect in creating peace and stability for our region. But it is not enough for ASEAN to simply be the initiator of forums. It is not enough for ASEAN to simply be like an event organizer, to host meetings where leaders come and find ASEAN capitals or cities to be the most congenial setting for them together. We believe in Indonesia that if we are to continue to maintain this driving seat role, we must have a more substantive contribution to make. The infrastructure is all there, the various forums are all there. It is now for us to develop a world view, an ASEAN view of how we wish these forums to develop. We cannot be in denial, because if we do not have a concept, others will bring the concept to us. That is the kind of view that Indonesia would like to suggest, and this becomes especially relevant this year, because as you are aware, in 2011, in November this year, we will be having the East Asia Summit, which for the first time will also include Russia and the United States. Now, these are countries that will not be quite shy, I'm sure, in presenting their own views about developments in the region. They can be quite forceful, and they can be quite determined in presenting their worldview, which I'm sure can be made complementary, can be synergic with the regional view as well. But the point is, I think ASEAN must have its own script. It must have its own ideas to mold this process further. And this is where we are now. The Secretary General would be aware of ASEAN that at the last summit, the leaders had a very good discussion on this issue and agreed that we will provide substance to the East Asia Summit that will convene later on in November this year, not only to discuss the traditional 5 issues, but also to delve into issues, so-called strategic issues and other issues of common interest in the region. For Indonesia, the kind of worldview that we are trying to project, to suggest, is to reject in the clearest manner possible the notion of like a return of Cold War mentality for our region. I can be very candid. The rise of countries like China, the rise of countries like India, the continued engagement of countries like United States, Australia and others, they are not problems to be managed, they are not problems to be contained, they are actually, can be for us an opportunity. We wish not to see the return of Cold War fault lines for our region, where ASEAN is presented with a choice of either this or that. Rather, what we are presenting is the notion of a dynamic equilibrium for our region, a state of affairs where fluidity, constant change is a given. There can be no perfect moment in time when you have a snapshot and to say we have a balance and we are now in a perfect state of being. Instead, we have constant evolution where there is constant changing and dynamics that we must try to manage. Essentially, our presentation is that security, stability, and prosperity are all assets that must be enjoyed equally by countries, that cannot be seen as being an either-or, qualities that can only be gained by one at the expense of the other. Now, we believe that ASEAN, given its composition, given the dynamics between the other major countries in the region, can play the role of an equilibrium maker. Not necessarily because it is the most powerful, but it is, we think, probably the most acceptable party that can make this equilibrium be realized. My final point, and I apologize for being too extensive in my remarks, East Asian regionalism is not only about being anchored in ASEAN, it is not only about ASEAN and the wider region, but also within the global community of nations itself. That is why this year Indonesia has suggested as a theme for ASEAN, ASEAN community in a global community of nations. We are setting in motion this year, like we did in 2003 when we began the ASEAN community process. We are beginning a 10-year pathway where by 2022, ASEAN will speak with greater cohesion on global issues. No longer are we going to be ASEAN on its own, ASEAN and the immediate region, but we see and we foresee in the future, increasingly, it is not enough for countries to do the multilateral foreign policies on its own, but increasingly as a group, ASEAN must have a more collective and cohesive view, which it already has. On a number of issues, ASEAN has expressed itself as a collective entity, but because it has been done in a haphazard and an ad hoc way, in an incremental way, we are, I think, punching below our weight. So in the next 10 years from 2012, ASEAN will have a roadmap, not for a common ASEAN foreign policy, because that is certainly not on what we anticipate, but certainly a common platform on global issues. Of course, our hope is that the ASEAN Secretariat will be provided with the sufficient resources to be able to carry out such a mission as well. And last but not least, when we speak of East Asian regionalism, it is not only at the ASEAN level, it is not only at the ASEAN classes, it's not even at the global level, but also, most of all, within the countries of ASEAN itself, namely a people-centered ASEAN. All these undertakings would become irrelevant if the ordinary citizens and peoples in ASEAN do not feel the immediate beneficial impact. And that is why the Secretary General and the member states of ASEAN are working diligently in ensuring that all the steps that we take engender a sense of ownership and a sense of participation by ASEAN community in terms of the peoples of ASEAN as well. Those are the thoughts that I wish to share with you in this fine occasion, and I do apologize if I take up too much of our time.